Good evening. On behalf of the Action Lab, I'm so pleased to welcome you all to Healing for Liberation, a community dialogue on healing and justice. This evening, we are so blessed and grateful to have with us four really dynamic community cultural workers, care workers, healers, scholars, movement practitioners, and elders. This multi generational discussion is one that I think is really suitable for our time, given particularly the conditions that we're collectively sort of facing, navigating, and trying to adapt to. For social justice movements for so long, the work of care and healing has been invisibilized, and yet the work of caretaking and healing is something that's been sort of imprinted, right, into our movements through our ancestral DNA, I would say, since the beginning of this nation's sort of emergence, right? Since the beginning of indenture and enslavement and genocide, peoples who have been most impacted by oppression and dominance have used the ancestral wisdom of their elders, of their communities, to ensure that their people are cared for, to ensure that their people are resilient and strong, and that they are nourished ultimately, so that they can continue to resist and so that they can continue to imagine and build the world that they imagine for their descendants. And so while we will hear in social justice movements today, we hear so much about healing justice as a practice or an emergent area or body of work, what we know is that in the Americas for over 500 years, people have been practicing healing justice. So this evening, I'm very, very pleased to invite to our virtual stage Gloria Rodriguez, community psychologist, veteran movement practitioner, Young Lords Party elder. Gloria is the founder of the Almas Latina. She's a national women's organization dedicated to uplifting, healing, and really connecting women who are interested in their own personal transformation and using their personal transformation as the building block of a better world, a more just and equitable world. So, Gloria, thank you for being with us.
Thank
It
you
is,
for having us.
as always, it's a pleasure and an honor to be in community with you. I'd also like to welcome Cherizar Crippen, who's joining us from the South. She is a youth worker, she is a healer, and she does what so many of us know is the laborious kind of undertaking of coordinating care. So Sherzar has founded Healing Justice Collective. She has brought healing into frontline first responder organizing spaces. And she continues in all of her work to be inspired, and also, I think, shaped by the ancestral spiritual work that carries so many of us, not only in our social justice movements, but in our world. So thank you, Sherzar, for
Thank
being.
you. Happy to be here.
I also want to bring forth Shane Bernardo, who's joining us from Detroit. Often we forget that our caregivers and our care workers are also the people that bring the food to our table and ensure equitable access to healthy, nourishing foods, and also to land, the stewards of our land, right? Our other healers whose work goes invisibilized. So I want to welcome Shane and thank Shane for being with us, bringing the wisdom of the land and of the body to our conversation. And last but certainly not least, I want to invite Suhaly Bautista, herbalist, AfroDominican herbalist, cultural worker, Brooklynite, representing the People's Republic of Brooklyn, mother, owner and founder of Mother Apothecary. Thank you, Suhaly, for being with us. So I'd like to invite y'all in. I'll start with Gloria and just tell us a little bit about how you see yourselves. One of the things a lot of people say, like, well, this is, what exactly are we talking about? Crystals? Are we talking about massages? What are we talking about when we're talking about healing? And I think one of the most important and rich perspectives we're going to hear this evening is of a movement elder who has the benefit of, I think, one of the many things that elders bring into our conversations. One of the greatest and most valuable things is that they have the benefit of having witnessed, experienced, and connected their work through generations. Gloria began as a young woman, as an adolescent, right, in the streets of Philadelphia and Brooklyn, and has the sort of the root, I think, the root understanding that movement hasn't always held space for healing and well-being, right? And we understand that a lot of our movements, especially because of the sense of urgency that we attach to our survival and our resistance, a lot of our movements often look at care and healing as a luxury. And so I want to invite you, Gloria, into the conversation, but just telling us a little bit about the work that you do. Again, a little bit about how this connects to the land that you're on, your location, and how you see yourself in relationship to the social justice landscape, given your evolution from being a frontline organizer into many other roles now: mother, grandmother, scholar, psychologist.
Okay, so first, let me just say how excited I am to be having this conversation with all of you. Thank you so much, Madi, for inviting me. Wait a second, this private chat is on. Okay, so that's a big question. That's a big question. And so I'm going to actually start by talking a little bit about the point that you raised, where in spaces, particularly in my experience with the Young Lords, which was a militant organization, right? A revolutionary organization. There wasn't necessarily this idea of care, right? Of healing, of care, of support for the for a lot of the psychological and emotional issues that we were dealing with, essentially, being at war. One of the things that I did in preparation for this talk was I spoke with Denise Oliver, and I remember for the 50th anniversary, one of the things that she said that struck me, that hit a chord, was that many of us that were in those movement spaces back in the late 60s and early 70s, we were dealing with post-traumatic revolutionary syndrome, right? Post-traumatic revolutionary syndrome. And so I wanted to really get a deeper sense of what that meant, right? And how we all experienced that. And so, the fact that we were adolescents, right? We were young people. We came into the organization and we were committed to the 13-point program and platform. We were certainly dealing with issues of surveillance, pro, violence, all kinds of infiltration, betrayals, things of that nature that were happening during the course of our time. And so, as young people, dealing with those kinds of fears, those kinds of concerns, those kinds of anxieties, right? We kept doing the work that we were doing, but what was really evident was that there was really no space for us to talk about those things, right? Because we were revolutionary. There was a particular perception of what that meant, right? So the spaces that we created, right, were much more on a personal level. They weren't necessarily on an organizational level, right? Because we were Young Lords 25 hours a day. And what did that mean in terms of our own care? What did that mean in terms of being able to rest, being able to be vulnerable, being able to have spaces where we could take care of ourselves psychologically, emotionally, and physically, right? And so there were so many sacrifices that we made, and we made those sacrifices, but there were consequences around that, right? And so as I think about that history, right, as I think about those issues, you talked about the power of reflection. As I reflect on that time, right, one of the things about me in the organization, I was actually one of three that was in the staff ministry. And I say that my psychological training, right, actually started when I was 18 years old in the staff ministry, right? Because we were, a small group that was available to members of the organization to really talk about some of those issues that they were experiencing, right? So coming out of that, coming out of the experience of being in the Lord's, really understanding, right, in retrospect, the fact that there were not these spaces where we could actually be authentic, be vulnerable, get the support that we needed. I mean, and some of that had to do with our youth, obviously, right? But I think that, coming out of that, moving into when I left the organization, really had to think about, what did I want to do? And so from there, kind of moving into, you know, um, feeling very called to do work that was based in healing, based in psychological wellness, emotional wellness. Um, so I went back to school after having my daughter. There's a whole story behind that, but I went back to school, and as a result of my graduate degree, this formed an organization called De Almas Latinas at the time, right? That organization was very intentional, right? Because I had been doing a lot of introspective work, a lot of empowerment work, a lot of spiritual sojourns, a lot of those kinds of things, but it was basically with organizations that were primarily white, right? And although there was a lot of healing that took place in that for me, right, I felt very much like this was something that our communities needed, right? And so I formed this organization in 1998 called De Almas Latinas, which was an outgrowth of the work. Um, and from there, it expanded into De Almas Women's Institute. We are actually now going into celebrating our 25th anniversary. But within that space, right? Within that space, that space really holds, right? The um, the energy, the intention that we are divine, right? That we are divine, sacred human beings, and that the oppressive systems that we have lived under, right, and these structures that we have lived under have disconnected us from our divine nature, from our authentic selves. And so within De Almas, through all of the 25 years of the work that we've done, right, we hold space for ourselves, and for me, healing the work that we do in De Almas, and the healing work that we do is community work. It's justice work, right? There's no way in my mind, and our philosophy for De Almas is that the work that we do has a direct impact on how we show up in community work. It has a direct impact on how we show up in our organizing, our activist work, etc., wherever that might be. And so if we're not doing the work, right, to to disconnect and separate ourselves from some of those internalized structures that we've, that we have as a result of being in a oppressive society, then we just bring some of that into our organizing work. And so the way in which I see healing and I see justice is one and the same. I think that healing work is justice work. I think that healing work is transformative work. It informs the way in which we show up in our activism, in our advocacy work, and it provides us with the space to then really claim and own and empower our divine sacred self. And it has a lens by which we really focus on culture, we focus on spirituality, we focus on personal as a way of really honoring, right, the cultures and the ancestral lineage by which we come.
Thank you, Gloria. And I think on that note, I'd like to invite in Cherizar, who was actually done, a lot of work coordinating and sort of training the next generation of youth healers. right? You do this work in the South. You do this through the Ancestral Spirit Collective. Your work is grounded in both spirit and the principles of organizing, and racial justice and anti-oppression work. And so, given what you've heard from Gloria and also just your own experience, how do you think we've evolved? How do you think, or have we evolved in terms of our thinking around the role of healing in organizing and justice work?
Ooh, you are asking the big questions. How have we evolved? I think that our most recent generations, right, Gen A and Gen Z, being a part of this like great resignation kind of movement, are no longer willing to show up and do any kind of work where they're going to be, what do you call it, burned out, where they're going to be martyred, where they're going to have to put themselves in a position of dealing with mental health things, being able to survive in this terrible economy that we're in alone. It's not going to be communal, it's not going to be collective. They don't want it. And so I'm really inspired by that. I think that it's not where I started in movement. It was kind of like this understanding that the more that you took on, the more that you did, the more valuable you are to movement. And we'll take care of you if something happens. And that didn't always happen. So I think that the next generation is definitely demanding something better and something new in the way that we hold space for one another and the ways that we even build our movements. I'm really so grateful to be able to witness young people from ages 6 all the way up to 22 talk about the issues that they care about and how they think that we're going to get to some sort of progress, right? So most recently at Highlander, I hold space for young people on a regular basis. I'm the first Black director for the Children's Justice Camp there and its 40-year history. And for the first time at the 90th anniversary in September, they had a children's justice camp section for young people to come to. And we did some landscaping. We looked at their communities and we asked them what they care about in their communities. And then we did some visualization, right? Because kids are naturally good at this, right? They're naturally good at dreamscaping. That's what we called it. So like, let's close our eyes. Let's think about, what are the steps that you have to do to get to where you want to go. And what was really beautiful, without any prompting whatsoever, they knew that we needed to have some kind of way to take care of each other as we're going. So if you want to clean up an area, something as simple as cleaning up your area, you know that people need rides. Somebody's going to need a babysitter. You're probably going to need lunch. Just like little things like that that they inherently thought to do was really beautiful to see. And when I'm talking specifically to Black youth about reclaiming some of the African traditional religions that have never been lost to us, but then have kind of been like under the surface for a while, they are thirsty for that reconnection. They're thirsty for that reclamation of identity and understand that it is central to us being able to build sustainable movements, right? We can build movements all day long, but if the foundation is not rooted in something that is the tie that binds, they don't last very long. And we can look at multiple, I might be jumping quite a bit ahead, but something that I get really passionate about talking about is the revolutions that we've seen and how some type of religion or spirituality or healing was a part of that. So we can go back to the Jamaican uprisings, Tacky's Revolt. We can talk about the Haitian Revolution. Civil rights even had Baptist church, right, is central. And so back to your question, what we have right now is a variety of people coming from all different types of spiritual and healing backgrounds coming together for these movements for, socioeconomic change, racial justice, who aren't all practicing the same things like it has been in the past. So something that I'm left with is like a question of like, what is the way forward? How do we find that tie that binds when we have people some people are they're in Ifa, some people are Hoodoo, some people are Christian, some people are like, I don't do religion. So how is it that we are sustaining ourselves? Because one of the things that our oppressors did from the very get-go was remove that from us. They knew that without that, it would be very, very difficult to get people to show up continuously. And and plan anything and plan anything together. And so I'm not, obviously calling for everyone to come under one umbrella, but like, how do we figure out what is the thing that ties us together? And I think that is figuring out how to, how to figure out what our individual communities need, right? Our localized communities need to feel healed and whole to show up for the work.
Thank you, Cherizar. And I think, reflecting on both you and Gloria's work, I think what's really interesting and also worth noting is that a lot of that work is invisibilized, but it's also invisible because it's work that happens in the interior space, right? It's work that happens on the inside, right? In terms of our psyches, our hearts, our spirits, etc. And so I want to invite Shane into the conversation because Shane Bernardo, does this work with food as healing, which is based in ancestral earth land-based practice, right? And food and land is probably one of the most palpable things that we have, right? You talk about the ties that bind us, Cherizar. I think maybe the original the original sort of point of reverence for all of humanity had to be land, right? Had to be the earth, because it's where we derived our nourishment and our sustenance from, which inherently makes it sacred, whether you see yourself as spiritual or religious or not. So Shane, for you who are both an anti-oppression facilitator, a storyteller, you're a grower. How does this question sort of how does this feel in regard to your work, which is so tangible, which is really fundamentally about ensuring that all people have access to the thing that all people need, which is nourishment?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, thank you, Action Lab and Marty, for hosting this space and having me be a part of it. I just like to take a moment to thank the creator for this day and for convening us here today and making it possible for us to be here and share space and learn from one another. I also want to take a moment to ask my ancestors to guide me as I speak today. As a cultural worker, as a caregiver within my family, as a land worker, as someone that is a grower as well, I see food justice work and land work as being deeply spiritual. And if we go far back enough in time, we can trace back our current struggles to our ancestral relationship to land. The birthplace of our ancestral and cultural traditions and rituals and celebrations, things that give us life. And I'm speaking as someone that is within the Philippine diaspora and was confronted with a deep sense of grief back in 2010 when my father had joined the ancestors. Um, to me, as a first generation person in the Philippine diaspora, he was my connection to back home, besides my mom, and so I relied on him to tell me stories about what it was like to grow up there, because that was not part of my upbringing here in the States. So what I found out in the process of grieving was um, that our proximity to land-based traditions is an indicator for our overall health, our physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual health. And I saw how throughout my father's lifetime, how he was attempting to transmute that grief that he inherited from our ancestors of being a person in the diaspora in our media environment, not really reflecting that ancestral identity back, how he was attempting to transmute that grief by practicing land-based culture in and around gardening. He was the gardener in the family. He was also the cook in the family. And in the process of grieving over him, I I was attempting to comfort myself by making meals that he used to make when I was growing up. And I found out in that process that I was able to recreate these meals just by simply remembering how it tasted, how things, how how I prepped some of the food by cutting them a certain way, how they looked, and so I was calling upon this embodied knowledge, and so along with the grief that I was feeling, which in some instances felt much older than my memory of him, I was also able to use that relationship to grief to pull out and pull up to the surface some of this ancestral memory, some of this embodied knowledge that I also inherited from my ancestors as well. And so the reason why that was so healing and so comforting for me is that I went from feeling a desolate place of feeling that I was lacking. I went from this place of scarcity to this place of abundance. I saw my own grief as this form of ancestral communication in a way that channeled and transferred um, ancestral wisdom from my father and from my ancestors, and allowed me to use food as a proxy for my relationship to this ancestral land. And so our food can be used, our food, our dishes, and other implements can be used as mnemonic devices that help preserve and channel this ancestral wisdom from a very deep place. And that work around grief was a very instrumental process for uncovering that wisdom. And so in the same way that we can inherit ancestral trauma, we can also inherit ancestral wisdom. And so those are some of the deep lessons that I learned in grieving on my father, but also reclaiming ancestral land-based practices in what I call food as healing.
Thank you, Shane. And I think that, you're sort of offering us the opportunity to think about this deficiency versus abundance, right? And even you're offering us, thank you, most importantly for your vulnerability and offering to us like this story about your grief is that often in looking to build the future or in looking to defeat quote unquote oppression or dismantle all of the forms of domination, whether it's colonization or racial capitalism or all of the things that we fail to actually engage deeply with our emotions, right? Particularly the ones that are connected to our suffering. And so I appreciate you both, offering the wisdom in that for reflection, for us to reflect on, and also, you know, sharing and how that sort of help you to build something that is not only of deep value and service to you, but the people around you. Thank you so much for that intervention. And I wanna invite um, Suhaly Bautista-Carolina to join us. So Suhaly, you talk about, you're an herbalist. In olden times, you might have been a medicine woman, right? Or some other term, right? All of our cultures and communities have different names for that, but you're very much a healer of the body, as is Shane, and the emotions, right? Because herbal medicine can be used holistically for so many things. So I want to invite you into this conversation, like particularly as someone who has a sort of a social enterprise. You run Mother Apothecary. You're very open and enthusiastic about sharing what that work means for you as a mother as well, which I think is really important since Shane's talking about caregiving for elders, caregiving for children. Both of these things are often also invisibilized. And so in bringing, visibility to the work of healing through plants and plant medicine, you've also brought a lot of visibility to the work of mothering and caregiving of children. So I want to invite you into the conversation. How is it for you, who sort of navigates all of these different spaces, both spaces of movement and social justice, but also you navigate the world of the so-called high arts, right? The world of our society's probably most revered cultural production. Um, yeah, what does this question mean for you?
Thanks, Maddie. I just want to start by reiterating the gratitude that has been echoing in this circle, beautiful circle, for you and for the Action Lab for joining us. I'm grateful to go last so that the wisdom of all the words have sort of stuck with me. And also just to start by with gratitude for I'm calling in from Lenapehoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenape people, and just grateful to have my feet on this ground. I will always feel like a blessing. So thank you for that. And so many things have come to mind as you all have shared. And one of them is that, Moon Mother, my practice, my spiritual herbalism practice, was birthed in the same timeline as the birth of my daughter, whose name is Luna. And so that makes me the Moon Mother, just logically. But also just thinking about, what I wanted to birth into the world beyond this beautiful human that is passing through me. And a lot of that was based in care for my people in my community, very locally, on this sort of, just on a nuclear level. It started in my home with my wife now, I think, who was my partner at the time, who was really suffering with some migraines and headaches. And I'd always seen myself as a caregiver and a nurturer. And I was asking myself, like, in what ways can I lean into this work more deeply? It resonates with me intuitively, and what is needed of me in this time so that I can be my best self and so that I can present myself like walking in my purpose. So that was the entry point. And I love that for me because I think it means that everything that I'm doing is really motivated by love for people and love for my people in particular. And this sort of call that I felt, that I heard within myself to rise to the occasion versus, searching for that thing that we were looking for. Instead, I sort of needed to just look in the mirror and assume that role. And that has been the way that I've sort of entered into this work. And I've always been, I'm such a New Yorker, right? Like the city kid New Yorker type of New Yorker. But at the same time, I always sort of held this, maybe I was an anomaly or was seen as an anomaly because I was such a nature girl. Like I look at the way that my daughter, I empty her pockets at the end of the day because her jackets are always very, very confusingly heavy, and it's because she's a rock collector, she's a collector. And I love that because we are so connected with through our love of this planet and of this earth and of this soil and of this land, and see the treasure that is in the physical land that we occupy, like jewels, right? Like we're collecting. We feel so enamored by this thing, and I teach her that there's real magic in the earth, and that we can collaborate with the planet, for our own value add, and that we also need to nourish the planet so that it can continue to feel like it, we're in relationship to each other, and that there's sort of this, reciprocal, circular relationship that's happening at all times. And yeah, the way that I saw or witnessed this happening in or herbalist, the trajectory of what that looked like felt very, I don't know, oftentimes I saw the examples of feeding into more capitalist infrastructure in the sense of like transaction with like a product and money. And that felt like I was going to have to fit myself into that structure in the beginning. And then, 2020 really broke everything apart, and it challenged me to imagine the way that I wanted Moon Mother to be in the world, and that was a reflection not only of myself, but of what I wanted to be and how I wanted to be. And so a lot happened in that year for me that has really helped me turn myself away from the things that I was seeing as the only example, and sort of imagine the role that I want to play, and how I can show up in a way that I think is of service to my people, and also standing in my own purpose. So it feels like I'm walking that path, and I'm learning so much. And one of the things really value is just sort of listening to myself and having a community that I'm learning from constantly, and lending my ear to the ground and listening to young people too. And anyway, I those are some of the things that I'm constantly thinking about in my work, and in particular in this sort of very transitionary moment in our world, in our movement.
Thank you, Suhaly. During the pandemic, it's funny you raised 2020. During the pandemic, and as a result of the pandemic, I actually spent a lot of time. I trained hundreds of organizers and social justice workers and practitioners around the country in healing, justice, and wellness. And this was sort of work that emerged. I've done healing work for, over 20 years, but this was work that emerged from institutional requests, right? Where social justice organizations would largely organize their work around this idea of power building, right? And sort of protecting and defending democracy in most cases, found that they were really, at odds with the moment, that their workflow was at odds with the moment, right? And a lot of the constructions around productivity, right? And what an urgency as well, right? The urgency of the work and the need to be productive in the work were at odds with the needs of people, right? And who were navigating not just their work, but navigating loss, navigating shutdowns, navigating all of the radical change that was happening, and all of the sort of that unveiling that happened at the top of the pandemic, right? Where, to Suhaly's point, everything got broken apart, broken open, exposed. And so as we start to, transition and navigate this moment in the pandemic, some of the feedback I hear from colleagues and peers is like, I really believe in that healing justice work, but it just takes so much time. It takes a lot of time, and we got work to do because we can go back to work now. Right. And so in the social justice spaces, a lot of disability justice advocates and organizers are saying, wait, like what we learned from that disruption, right, was that there were so many people who were left behind in our work, so many people who were kind of relegated to the margins, who couldn't participate because conditions that were set didn't allow for full participation by differently abled people, by caregivers, by others, by low income people, maybe who were bound to the needs of their necessities, right, their homes, maintaining their homes. And so now a lot of people are quote unquote returning to normal. And so, but based on these old standards, right? And there's a tension because, Cherizar was talking about the sort of the silent quitting and the younger generations kind of resisting to rigidity and old patterns of work. All of this stuff is fundamentally rooted in white supremacy, is rooted in capitalism, and it's rooted in the idea that our value is defined solely by our ability to produce something, right? And so as organizers, because all of you have done organizing work and do organizing work, what do you say to this? How do we navigate that tension in particular? Gloria talked about all the reasons, or some of the reasons, I guess, why this isn't a luxury, and how reflecting back on work of 40, 50, 60 years ago, even, folks were, have started to, a lot of elders have started to unlearn some of these standards, right? Unlearn some of these behaviors. How do we navigate this right now, right? Why is healing justice? Why is wellness work? Why is our collective well-being? Why is all of that essential for our liberation at this time? And anyone is welcome to chime in. What does your practice teach you about liberation? We can go there as well. Gloria.
I will do that. Okay. So I think that one of the reasons why these intergenerational conversations are so important is precisely because we get to hear and understand and learn about practices that happened in the past that don't serve our well-being, and in turn don't serve the organizing spaces and the communities that we are called to serve. And so, with that said, I think it's important for us to think about, you know, um, building new structures, right? Intra-organizationally, that really center our well-being. And to my point earlier, that in the YLP, where our adage was, you are young lord 25 hours a day. I mean, that's the same concept. That's the same concept when you talk about folks now going back to, oh, now things are normal, we can go back in, we can go back into our organizing work, and we have to catch up. We got to do this. We got to, we've got to be you know moving and grooving, without the thought of how do we take care of ourselves to then do the work that we need to do. I mean, the bottom line is, for me, if we're not healthy, if we are not psychologically, physically, emotionally balanced and healthy and caring for ourselves, right? And we have to center that into our everyday practice. And so, one of the things that I did during the pandemic, because we were all in isolation, many of us were feeling, all kinds of uncertainty and fear and anxiety and all of that. I was in my home by myself. My children were in their homes. I didn't get to see my kids, my grandkids. I mean, we all have had those experiences, and so with all transparency, I was feeling like I was falling into a depression, right? I was still doing my work, right, virtually, but I was falling into this really, mild case of depression, because I felt so isolated and so disconnected. And I think that when we talk about, healing work, I mean, we're talking about connection as well, right? So I do what I do best, right? I did De Almas virtually. I started a meditation group for women called De Corazon Connection, right? And I put it out there, and hundreds of women 3 times a week were coming onto these calls, right? Where we would meditate, where we would reflect, where we would connect with each other. And then I continued to do the De Almas workshops online. And so it brought in, to your point, Mari, it brought in, groups of folks, right, that have been invisibilized and or have not been um, centered, right, in the social justice work. So that during the pandemic, when you're doing, work virtually, when you're creating, opportunities for people to come into spaces and connect with each other, and and meditation groups, right, so that we can center ourselves, we can, feel what we are feeling. The first meditation group topic was all the feels, right? So that we can acknowledge what we are all feeling, unlike, right, my experience 50 years ago, where there was no spaces for that, right? So part of what I'm saying is that, for me, showing up, and doing doing these various workshops, and the meditation group is still going strong, and we're almost 3 years into it, right? Because there's something really, really important about connection. There's something really important about, community, and that in and of itself is healing, right? So I think that for me, when I think about my own practices are definitely meditation, prayer work, going into nature, right? And music and dance, and the creative arts, right? All of those things that are uplifting to the spirit, that are uplifting to our soul, right? And that are healing. I mean, we have all of these various modalities that that, depending on who, how, it's not a one size fits all, right? People gravitate toward and they participate in what they are called to, what their body is calling them to, to engage in, what their spirit, what their heart is calling them to engage in. So for me, doing that work over the last 3 years was so inclusive, so empowering, so connecting, and very, very healing to myself, right? I mean, because that was the starting point. It was me. I was experiencing that. If I'm experiencing that, I know a number of other people are experiencing that. And I think that one of the things that has been talked to in this panel is, we come to this because for me, I come to this work because I was called to do this work, right? This is my love work. This is the work that I've been called to do in the world. And I know that, deep in my bones, right? I know that deep in my bones. And the work flows and it moves in different directions based on what is happening in the moment. And so to your point, in this moment, right, we cannot make the same mistakes, right? We have to be able to rest. We have to be able to um um you know have joy in our lives, right? I mean, I think that's the other point that maybe we can speak to, is that when we're doing social justice work, advocate work, activism work, you know, I mean, I think that in many ways there are these either ors, right? It's like, oh, we got to do this, we got to do this now. This requires a certain kind of seriousness, this requires a certain kind of action. And what about the joy in our lives, right? What about the connections that we have? What about the wonder? What about the things that we personally, need in order to feel whole? And that will shift and change depending on who the individual is, right? But I know for me, I know I love travel. I love travel. I'm like you, Marty. I want to go all over. I want to go, internationally and do this work. And I have started doing that. But I realize that that's the evolution of my work, right? And this power of reflection and contemplation and really touching in spiritually to what we are called to do as the next step requires quiet. It requires solitude. It requires those things that, those practices that invoke, the other parts of ourselves, the other voices, because all of that other stuff from where I stand, all of that other stuff is really, egoic. I mean, it's coming from that, perspective. It's coming from the mind, not the higher self, not the spiritual self, not the heart self, not the soul self. It's coming from the mind. And so, that has its place. But I think that there is a way in which we need to address building and rebuilding and reimagining these infrastructures that we have created that don't allow for other possibilities.
Thank you. And I want to invite in, I just Cherizar because I was thinking about your dreamscaping with the children, right? Good organizers know the celebration and culture and joy and all of that is part of organizing, or should be part of good organizing. But what is the place of the radical imagination, right, that children have? And what do all of these, and this is really for all of you, like, what do all of your practices themselves teach you about freedom? What do they teach you about liberation? What do they teach you about? Gloria's talking about infrastructure, the types of structures that we build to support our work and to transform our conditions. What do they teach you about what other structures or forms of organization are possible? I would love to hear from any of you.
I can jump in real quickly. Something that just comes to the top for me is working on long-term projects with young people, and coming like right from the beginning with the need to have some type of accountability culture here, right? And so what they've grown used to in school is that a lot of things are punitive, a lot of things are punishment. We know how the school system, school to prison pipeline sets kids up to be either good little worker bees or good little prisoners, right? And so they see that. they know that these kids are really smart, really smart, and they see that and they're like, okay, well, if we're in charge here in this space, which they are when they're in my space, they're in charge. I'm there to make sure no one gets caught on fire. Almost 100% rate with that. So the kids, they decided that they wanted to come up with their own accountability process, right? Which I think is like fundamental to healing justice, right? You can't, you end up in a lot of situations I've seen anyway. I'll speak with I statements where you have some people who are over accountable and they're burning themselves out, and some people who are under accountable and they're just kind of riding the wave. And then you have right sized accountability, right? So we talked about that, and I sat back and let them come up with, not let them, they took the lead on coming up with what their accountability process would be with each other, which I thought was like really, really beautiful and took some imagination because they were creating something that doesn't exist in their lives. Shoot, it doesn't exist in my life. Right. And I thought that that was really beautiful. And then they were like, this is kind of a living document. When it came time to have some hard conversations, they were like, you know what? Actually, this process doesn't feel good. We should change this, right? And just so that flexibility, I think is really, really beautiful and something we all need to kind of hold on to is that we're in an experiment, right? We're in just grand experiments, like Adrian said, something like all organizing is science fiction, right? So we don't have it all together. We're trying things out, seeing if they work, if they don't work, and moving on. So getting married to the ways of doing things doesn't work anymore. We have to like really, really do some soul searching and be willing to reshape as we go. There was something else I wanted to name that's just escaped me. Mm. We definitely want to be able to stay open to that experimentation. I'll leave it at that. Because we just don't have it all together. That's what I wanted to say. We're always practicing something. We are always constantly practicing something. So we can practice liberation, right? We can practice healing justice, right? We don't have to have it 100% together to be in a practice. And maybe one day, maybe this generation, next generation, so on, we get closer and closer to getting it right for that moment for those people in that time.
I really appreciate that you introducing the idea of practice, right? Because I think that for some people there can be a tension, or again, also in my travels, right, around the ecosystem. It's like I think there's this idea that somehow healing, joy, connection for some is looked at as sort of a counterpoint to rigor, right? Like we can't be rigorous if we're doing these other things, as opposed to maybe embracing the idea that we can be rigorous in the practice of these things, as we build the new world. Shane, what have you learned from the land? I think of, I think of your work as a grower in a place like Detroit, where you're really like vulnerable to the elements in a real way. Um, but also, I don't know if you remember this, Shane, you took us on a tour once upon a time through Detroit to different gardens, and you came with us to the home of Grace Lee Boggs. And I feel like there's so much wisdom in this place that for some people has been forsaken, but that we know is like rich, really rich with culture and resistance and a liberation ethic, that is unmatched. So I want to invite you into the conversation.
Yes, thank you for posing that question, and thank you for recalling that really sweet memory. um, and so that reminds me to actually to give a shout out to the Emergent Strategies Ideation Institute and Gender Somatics, and also their sister organization, Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity, who are also doing somatics work. And it was those two experiences that led me into developing this work around food as healing and reclaiming ancestral land-based practices as a healing modality. And what these practices taught me is that we all have the capacity to heal and be healers ourselves. Part of the reason why I do this work is because of this little person here. I don't know if you can see that picture, but this is little Shane in the first grade. And the reason why I bring this little person in the room today is because I'm carrying this person with me everywhere I go. I'm carrying this little person with me when I go into movement spaces. And I constantly have to negotiate space for this young person to be there. And when this young person was in first grade, this young person learned how to cope with intergenerational trauma without the resources needed to do so. And so as an adult, I'm constantly confronting ways in which my lower self, my lower vibrations, come out in spaces that I share with other people. And so the work of healing myself is also part of the collective work that we're doing within movement spaces, and that our liberation is intertwined with one another. That took a lot of work to get there. That took a lot of self healing. That took a lot of vulnerability. That took a lot of humility, um, and took a lot of unlearning some really toxic behavior that I'm not still fully healed from. This is a lifelong body of work. And so I would like to, another reason why I bring that young person, little Shane, into the room is because I feel in some sense healing work gets unfairly um, mischaracterized as kind of a status symbol that only certain people can do it, and it gets uh, professionalized in some ways, where it becomes inaccessible for maybe those of us that have learned how to cope without the resources needed to do so. And so I just want to encourage us all to um, really center and channel a sense of humility when we talk about healing work, and that it's accessible to all of us, and all of us are capable of doing this work and healing that young person inside of us.
I really appreciate that. And I would add to that the commodification of healing work, right? Because as Suhaly touched on this briefly in terms of, having to navigate the marketplace, is that our healing practices and traditions are often, packaged and designed for sale in the market, right? And so healing practitioners in turn can also become products um, for trade and sale in the marketplace. And what that does in terms of access for probably the people most in need is make them feel really inaccessible, or unattainable, right? So I remember I was doing a healing justice workshop in New York, Brooklyn, probably like April 2019, and was organizers from all over the country, mostly working class folks. It was a multiracial room. But offline, one of the elders in the room, an elder Caribbean woman, said, all this stuff sounds good, but I don't know how to do this. And so I said, but well, tell me, what do you do? What do you do when your head hurts? What do you do when your grandchildren are not feeling well? And she started to recite, a litany of herbal medicines. I make this tea and I cook this thing and I put this poultice on them. And I was like, well, all of those things those are all healing practices, right? And she's like, but my grandmother taught me that. And I said, right. And that's probably one of the most valuable sources you could have, right? And so all of our communities have access to these things. And I would say, I would venture to say, independent of our racial and ethnic backgrounds, like every culture has a tradition of something, right, that is tied to the land that they're from, and that has the potential to heal, to be medicine, and to restore balance ultimately. Because I think whether we're talking about our physical, emotional, spiritual body, we're talking about the restoration of balance. And so I appreciate deeply, Shane, your intervention about humility, and also, access, right? We have a question from one of our viewers, which is like, what are your practices? And Gloria, you started to talk about this in the context of like the trauma that we experience in movement as well, not just the trauma that we're bringing from our lived experience, but like violence and trauma that we're forced to navigate in movement spaces, right? The question is, what are your practices in relationships and groups when harm and deep pain show up? What are your practices in relationship and groups when harm and deep pain show up? I think, Cherizar, you started to talk a little bit about accountability. That made me think about restorative justice as a healing practice, transformative justice as a healing practice, which both say we have to have both accountability and support, right? When harm is committed. How is doing that work liberatory? And how is doing that work essential, if at all, for our movements?
I'm not seeing the rest of the question. When are practices in relationship and groups? What are the
When
practices when harm and
harm and deep pain show up? Harm and deep pain. So how are we addressing suffering? How are we addressing interpersonal conflict?
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say this is not the question I intended to answer, but I will say something about it because pain is a natural part of the human experience, and I think just kind of acknowledging that that's something that we move through, and that there are very unique and personal ways that people are moving through pain and harm and trauma that it can be present, and still it can be present in spaces. And I think facilitators and organizers can, when trained or when well trained, can often identify this in a room and make decisions about whether extracting that is a value add for the group, or and kind of illuminating that and bringing that into play and discussing it is something that is enriching for this space, or whether there are other ways to sort of move through this moment that address what is present and also hold the circle in a way that centers care. So I think there are a lot of different ways to do that. I think my own personal practice is to acknowledge that this is in the space firstly, and to not shy away from the fact that this is present and that it may be present in many of us, and there are many unique ways of moving through that, to offer ways of caring. Sometimes I think many of us here are trained in emergent strategy, and sometimes there is a wellness or care station, or they feel like little altars everywhere all over through the room, where you might visit in order to access something that, at least for this present moment, invites a calmness or something in you that allows you to be in this space. And then there are moments where that trauma and pain does not allow you to be present in that moment. And I think that there are moments in in group work or in movement work where your healing is a precedent to your participation in that space, potentially, right? So there are so many different ways, I think, that I myself personally offer or invite care into a space through herbs, through medicine, through teas, through tinctures and elixirs and breath work that show my interest in caring for the person, and also in caring for the body, the sort of entire group that is in relationship to each other in that space. So, and maybe that's not a full answer, but it's one way that my practice sort of engages with pain in the moment, or trauma in the moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to add to what Suhaly was just mentioning. It brings back a memory when there was a Visiones workshop, which is the Dayama signature workshop at the beginning of every year. and it's structured, although there's some flow and flexibility to it from year to year. But the first part of the workshop is always about release, right? It's always about releasing um, things, emotions and behaviors and things that don't serve us, right? I mean, we kind of do a retrospective on that, and we do that through various exercises and um, and rituals and group work, right? And the second part is about, it's more of a visionary, creative manifestation piece. I remember one year we were doing the end of the release part, which is about forgiveness, right? And we set up ritual to do that. We have altars around the space. We have an altar in the middle of the circle, and it's a really powerful release for many of the participants. There was a participant in that workshop that had just had a really painful, devastating experience in her relationship, and essentially she was like, "Oh, I'm not ready to let any of this go. I'm not ready to forgive. I can't do any of this right now." And then, as and so it was, was like, okay, you know um and then, we just moved on. We held the space for her, and then we moved on to another sister. And then all of a sudden, there was wail, this wail of emotion. I mean, this like wailing and screaming and crying and all of this emotion. I think that in that moment, one of the things that I know about me as a facilitator and as a healer is that my skill is really around energy. It's really around holding energetic space, right? Everybody has their different ways in which they do that. And so I remember inducting the group into holding space for this pain, right? For the betrayal, for the rage that was present. And I got to tell you, it was difficult. It was difficult. But I think that, and it was difficult, I think, for the sisters in the space. I mean, this is where we hold that tension, right? Hold that tension between sort of being bearing witness to this pain, to this trauma, to this betrayal, to all of that, but also, right, having the experience of some of those things as well, right, which can serve as a healing not only for the one sister who is kind of experiencing that, but for everyone that's in the group, right? I think that this is where it's really important that when we offer spaces to do this kind of deep healing work, this work where we know that pain and trauma and all kinds of emotions are going to be present, that there be, right, not only a spirit container to hold that, right, but also that there be facilitators that are trained in that. I think what's happening now, from my perspective, and from the 25 years that I've been doing this work and training and mentoring lots of young women through the Dayamas work, is that you have folks that do a couple of workshops and they think that they can just kind of go out there and now they are experts at this, and then they set up shop. And going back to your point, right, it becomes a very sort of transactional experience, and I think that that is a real I, I think that that's really um, dangerous. I think it's dangerous for folks, right? So I'm saying that to say that in these spaces where we know that these kinds of things are going to come up for our own healing, right? and for the healing of the collective, we need to make sure that the facilitators in place have done their own healing work so that they can hold the energy that is present. And if you haven't done it, then maybe you do some more work and don't show up in that space.
So I think that that's really, that's an interesting point, right? And both your point and Shane's intervention. No, I think that they kind of are like these 2 points are complementary and also at odds, right? Because Shane is talking about, the openness and humility and practicing healing, but you're talking about on the other end of the spectrum, like the great responsibility that is required, right? In terms of like, because there are potential risks associated. And I think I want to bring into the conversation, you all were speaking in response to a question from one of our viewers. I think this is actually part of the tension and part of the challenge that a lot of organizations face when they confront the question of whether or not to engage, with their teams, with organizers in this way, because I think that there's an intense amount of vulnerability. There's an intimacy that people don't necessarily want to, or sometimes just have the capacity to engage, right, in these spaces that historically maybe haven't always been places of work, but that are now, institutions, right? These are a lot of, not all organizing happens within the confines of the nonprofit, industrial complex, but a lot of it does, and that's different from, when we're thinking about like our power movements, the Black Power movement, the Young Lords, the Brown Berets, like it's a very, it might be inspired by, but it's a very different type of organizing institutionally and like in terms of its infrastructure. And so people are trying to, I think, very legitimately wrestling with and also trying to figure out, well, what are the appropriate boundaries and what are the appropriate limits to healing work in organizing spaces, in social, in the broad social justice landscape. I think the other thing is that for some folks, and a lot of, I think all of us have to, Suhaly's talking about being a spiritual herbalist. Shane ties his work to the land with ancestral practice and reverence of the land. Everyone on this, self included, like everyone in this conversation has at some point referenced sort of the undercurrent of not necessarily religion, but like spiritual awareness, right? And spiritual wisdom that comes from this work. And I think that for a lot of people in social justice spaces who don't have a direct connection to that, there's a sense of alienation, right? Or that this work is something they may or may not be able to participate in based on either the absence of a spiritual worldview or practice, or because it's culturally alienating at some point. I mean, I have to say, having worked in multiracial spaces, I definitely see the prevalence of this type of work more frequently in BIPOC spaces, in Black and Indigenous and immigrant spaces, than I do in other spaces. And as people of color begin to take leadership in multiracial organizing and social justice spaces, what I think everyone is sort of forced to confront is like a cultural tension on some level, right? So I'd just be interested to hear from all of you that engage with organizations in different ways and also run your own organizations. I know, Cherizar, you're like building youth cadre, right? You're like building youth workers and youth healers to go out into the field. How do you navigate these things? Like, how do you translate this thing that we're talking about that for a lot of people feels intuitive, it feels natural, it feels connected to everything that has come before us? How do you navigate the spectrum or the continuum of from that experience to folks that have no experience but still have like the very same needs?
I think what you were saying earlier about like talking to this woman who was like, I don't do that healing stuff, but you know how to make these teas, you know how to make these poultices, you know how to do all these things, right? I think it's helping people to realize that what they're already doing in their daily life, what they've already learned, or can remember ancestrally in their body, is what it is, right? That's what we're talking about, and you can build on that. You can learn from other people. Personally, in my work with the Ancestral Spirit Collective, I have these young people who want to do organizing in their community. Maybe they already are doing some. Maybe this is their first time. We have a good mixture. But they all know that they need mentoring. Like that is like something we really across age, right? Across age, I would speak from like millennial on down. We're all looking for mentors. We're looking for somebody to come and teach us the ways of being. So making that available to folks that are seeking it, in my experience anyway, people who come and they show up to these spaces, it's not that they don't. It's not a case of they don't want to learn. They just don't know where to start, right? And so directing them back to themselves first, like it's already in you. It's already in you. You already know some stuff. Trust me, you have an altar at home right now, baby. You have, that place where you put all the things that you put on your face and your hair stuff and everything. It's an altar to your beauty. It's an altar for you. Maybe you want to get into African traditional religion kind of things, and you're like, oh, I was raised Christian and stuff. But did you have this space where you put all of your deceased grandparents' pictures up, right? That is an altar, right? Just reminding them that they have all these things around them all the time anyway, is a place to start. When it comes to organizations, you said some interesting things, especially in the multicultural spaces. There is a tension in like, what do we share and what do we not share? What is the through line we can bring everybody around the fire with, right? I personally, I choose to work in BIPOC spaces and Black autonomous spaces because I don't know how to navigate that. I want to be able to share freely as much as possible. And I do believe in gatekeeping some practices, right? Everything ain't for everybody. And I don't know, particularly what I'll say white folks. I encourage white folks to go and tap into these are folks who actually have a way higher chance of being able to look at their ancestry and reach way back, right? Prior to whiteness, before it just became like this amalgamation of like all their cultures and stuff. They have that access to that a lot of times to be able to reach back and look and see what their folks were doing. How are they honoring the lands, before whiteness became a thing and colonization became a whole thing? How were they, what were they eating? Like to Shane's, point around food. Food is like such a great uniter, right? So like what are the things that white folks can do in their own spaces to be able to reconnect to that? Because being afloat and then cosplaying other people's cultures in order to get your healing that ain't it. So I stay in my lane where I feel comfortable. Um, I wanted to touch on this question that had came up previously very quickly from Manuela, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I think that there's a lot to be said about organizations and whether or not they equip themselves on the front end, whether they front load. How do we handle these situations when they arise? Because they're going to arise. They just are, right? We're humans. We're going to hurt each other. Sometimes there's going to be harm. Sometimes there's going to be deep pain, right? It's not practical to think that you're going to be able to organize and it never comes up. So how are we front loading and making sure, do you have those mediators on speed dial? Do you have those people to come in and facilitate those hard conversations? And every space is not for everything, I will say. I think what I've witnessed happen is that people are navigating deep harm. They're, navigating these hurts in a space where they're supposed to be figuring out canvassing for that day, right? Because there isn't another space for them to do it. So if that's not front loaded and like letting them know, like, hey, we have this other space for us to be able to handle this, it leaks into everything else. And it's not always productive or received well when that happens. So that would be my encouragement to organizations to we talked about this a little bit, Mari, like healing is not putting a altar in the corner and forgetting about it, right? Healing is not having somebody come and do a grounding at the beginning, do some deep breathing, and now we work, and that's it, right? It has to be woven throughout every single thing that you're doing, or your people will not be able to continue to show up like as well as they could, right? As rigorously as you want them to, right? So yeah, there.
Thank you. And thank you for, bringing in that healing is dynamic, right? That there isn't, Gloria was talking earlier about how it's not a one size fits all or one modality fits all. And now you're talking about sort of the dynamic nature of it, right? Because we also heal in response to external conditions. This isn't all entirely about our personal trauma. right? We're talking about social justice, so we're also talking about vicarious trauma, right?
Right.
Or the trauma that we experience when we bear witness to violence, right? And that's
Mhm.
all the violences that we're experiencing um, across the world, but we're primarily in the US right now on this panel. So whether it's police violence, racial violence, violence against women, trans folks, children, right? All of the violences and all the forms of domination. And those are structural and systemic things. So I think that's the other place I'd be interested to hear y'all go is like, when we talk about organizing, fundamentally what we're talking about is a response to and an attempt to disrupt and interrupt systemic and structural violence, right? Systemic and structural oppression, and the absence of structural care, whether we're talking about healthcare or sound public education or good public transportation or fair wages for workers, like all of those things that we are fighting for are actually forms of structural care, right? And the need for, or the heightened need for individual care and self care and collective care is actually also in response to that structural violence or the absence of those structural care interventions, right? And so I think a lot of folks are not, we sort of forget that care exists on a continuum, and the thing that we're all fighting for is usually in the domain of structural care, but that all of these other practices we're talking about are on the way to that, right? They're kind of workarounds as we navigate the absence of those things. And I want to bring in Audre Lorde, right? The quote that we all know that I think should be printed everywhere all the time, which is like, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. I wonder, for all of you, like, as you build institutions, right? But institutions that are rooted in these very particular healing modalities, right? And collective care structures. How do you build infrastructure for care that responds to structural violence, systemic violence? A lot of you do facilitation, a lot of you do public speaking, a lot of you do training, right? You help to build capacity for other people to do what you do. How does this contribute to sort of the big intervention? Don't be shy now.
So I don't know if this is a clear response, but it just popped into my head, so I'm gonna say it. Um, I remember when we were, you know, um, when we were all in the movement as young people, and we really thought that revolution was going to happen, that it was going to be imminent, right? That the struggles that we were engaged in and the vision for, an end to, oppression and capitalism and um, the vision of a world that would be, just for our people in our communities. Like we really thought that was going to happen, like in our imminent future. I think that one of the things that you know I think I don't know if it was Shane or someone that brought up was this notion of flexibility and flow. I think that when we talk about the work that we're doing, we really need to be mindful that it is an evolutionary process, right? That it's evolutionary. And so it kind of goes back to what you were talking about before, where, the question becomes, do we go back to the old structures, right? and or do we build new structures that really centralize some of the things that we've been talking about today? And I think that I think part of it may not part of it is connected to some of the things you mentioned about rigor, but I think also another part of it is connected to um, seeing, the work that we're doing as a process over time, seeing it as more evolutionary, right? Um, and that that we have to really assess, right? Assess how we are doing that work, how we are centering the community care, self care, um, as a way of sustaining sustaining ourselves and sustaining organization. So I just wanted to kind of bring that into the conversation around, how we build these new infrastructures within nonprofits or within the healing work that we're doing, from the perspective of seeing our work as a process, as a continuation, as consistent, but also as evolutionary, and that those within that trajectory, we assess, we evaluate what the needs are for ourselves and for the people that we are in relationship with. So um, there was a group that I formed after um, after one of the Visiones workshop during COVID, and we called ourselves Sisters of Flow and Fire. And so when I hear um, the conversations around holding this tension, right? I mean, that immediately came to my mind, like this flow, and then there's fire, right? And that they complement each other, and that those energies can be used separately and together when we're doing our organizing work. So,
Thank you.
mhm.
Thank you. And I want to invite Shane into the conversation.
Thank you, Mari. Um, as I was listening to Gloria, your words reminded me of the circumstance I found myself in a couple summers ago. Um, I had been caregiving for my brother who recently transitioned. Actually, December 17th will be his anniversary of him ascending to the ancestors. And during the summer when all the racial justice protests and marches were going on, I found myself in a pool of self-pity because I wanted to be out in the streets, marching and speaking truth to power and so on and so forth. And I had this this moment of clarity, and I was like, the same issues, the same conditions that folks are fighting against out on the streets also produced the chronic health disease that my brother was suffering from, and that our own personal homes and relationships are also a front line for this work as well. And so in that moment of clarity, I found that there was a deep, profound connection between the work that we're doing as caregiving and the work that we're doing as community organizers. And so I'm sharing that in an attempt to connect the personal and the collective together, and say that when we are out in the streets speaking truth to power and doing organizing work, that is care work. That's coming from a deep, profound sense of care for ourselves and for our families and for our loved ones and our community. And it's from that place of care that roots us in the sense of a place and deep connection and um and sometimes ancestry and spirit. And that's what keeps us going. And I saw that come up in during the pandemic, in the form of pods, in the form of mutual aid efforts, is that we were building resiliency by coming together and building healthy relationships with one another. And the resources that we're sharing were actually byproducts of those relationships. The food, the diapers, the water, the money, the and all the other resources were just a byproduct of the community that we are creating through our pods and through our mutual aid efforts. And so really the foundation for healing is reconnecting with one another, and to to really address the transactional nature in which uh, sometimes healing work um, occurs in, and to create long lasting, meaningful, healthy relationships with one another.
So thank you for that, Shane. We have another question in the chat, which is, what are the characteristics of healing centered organizations? And what is in the way of us reshaping organizations to embody this? And go ahead, Cherizar. I see Cherizar. I think Cherizar is ready for this question.
I guess this question excites me quite a lot because I think about it all the time. I think that what I'm trying to do, I'll say that, what I'm trying to do with a few brave healing justice soldiers at this time is form a cadre that can exist outside of the organization, but also participate in the membership, help inform. I think something that comes up, or I know from my personal experience, something that comes up is when you have healers, when you do have organizations who are like, we're going to have a healing justice person as a part of the staff, right? Is that person gets easily overwhelmed because it's always like one person, right? That person is wildly overwhelmed, right, by all the needs of the group. They're also beholden to this organization for their paycheck, for their livelihood. And when that happens, it can really confuse um, what you're able to do. I've known of, how do I put this? I'm not knowing all the tea. There's a way in which sometimes big mindfulness will pop up, right? So we need the people to get back to work. So we need you, healer, to come in and give them yoga, give them a session or whatever to like say what they got to say and get back to work, right? And I've seen people who have been staffed in that way get really burned out over that and feel really disconnected from their power and their purpose because they're trying to keep people working instead of addressing what's really going on. So an experiment that I'm looking, that we're moving forward with, I keep having to say it, it's happening, right? Is being in a cadre formation. So still holding membership within that organization, still being involved in their strategic planning and all those things, whatever a member would be involved in, but also being able to be like this crouching tiger in the corner over here, like organizing on a spiritual level, feeling mental health level, and available to give those offerings when the time is right to the organization to even go a step further. I think something that has been happening for many, many years is that healers and healing justice has been looked at as like a side dish, as a support of organizing instead of its own organizing in its own right. So thinking about what are the ways in which we can do spiritual direct actions? What are the ways in which we can start to build toolkits, that not just for people who want to read Google Docs all day long. All of those sorts of things. We have something weird going on in the chat. I'm gonna ignore that. But there are so many examples of cadres popping up. I'm really deeply interested. If anybody wants to like nerd out about this, please hit me up. Spiritual direct actions, like I'm not going to say it on the on this broadcast, but there's so much we can do. We have our oppressors have altars to white supremacy everywhere, right? We saw in 2020 a lot of those get pulled down. And I think that it gave a shift. I felt a shift in the energy of those spaces where those things were removed. So just thinking along those lines, what are the ways in which we can disrupt all the altars to white supremacy? What are the ways that we can heal the land, heal places where tragic events have occurred? Further, something that we really want to do, and anybody wants to reach out to me, Cherizar serves at gmail.com, hit me up. We're doing a spiritual landscape map so that we can actually look, we're starting with the southern region, actually look and see where are the churches that rock with the BIPOC queer folks, right? Where are the mosques? Where are the parks where you can go and not be harassed by Karens? Where are the natural bodies of water for you to go do your rituals? Who are in your area? So all you have to do is go and like click a little link in your area and have all that information available to you to make it more accessible and less mystified, right? So I really look forward to people doing more things like that, so that these organizations have a place to go. I don't think it needs to be necessarily living inside of an organization, the people who are moving that way.
Thank you so much. I wanted to actually invite Gloria to respond because cadre is a very interesting word for folks that come out of militant movements, right? Militant revolutionary movements. So Gloria, I'm just curious, like, what is your reaction to hearing cadre used in this way in relationship to healing, right? In relationship to these other interventions, non-militaristic and perhaps revolutionary, but non-militaristic, non-militant movement interventions?
Actually, I think I have to kind of feel into that a little bit more. I mean, when she said cadre, I mean, I immediately went back to, the YOP days, but it didn't necessarily trigger a reaction for me one way or the other. I think that I understand what that term means, just in terms of the sort of a membership, right? And I think that for me, if in fact there was, that's really interesting. I don't think I was prepared for that question, and I have to only because I really trust my body, and I trust what gets motivated in my body. And when she said cadre, that didn't really trigger me one way or the other. I mean, it actually took me down memory lane, but I don't use that term, right? Even when in the work that I do, in the relationships that I have with folks, from the movement, I don't use the word comrade, right? I don't use that word. And there's a reason why I don't use that word, right? And so I think for me, in terms of where I'm at now, and seeing the different movement spaces that have been created, I kind of feel like using that old language, for me, kind of keeps us stuck in that old place, right? And so, and I had that reaction to many of my, colleagues that were in different organizations during that time. And as we're having conversation, when the rhetoric and the language is very much based in that time. So that's that's my response. I feel like moving forward, um, I personally have I personally feel that creating language that is more appropriate to this moment in time for me, right, and to the future of our work for me is is necessary to create something new. So yeah, so that's where I'm at with this. Can I ask why you chose to use that term, cadre?
Look, I'm typing to the chat to you like, wow, I never thought about it that way. um, the reason being, it was the thing that I felt most embodied what I wanted to do. It was a word that was available to me. Let's put it like that. It was a word that was available to me that sounded exactly like what we wanted to be doing. But I agree. I agree so much about finding new language. That makes a whole lot of sense. Is there, I wonder if there is a term that exists that kind of describes what I just described. Again, like, so a grouping of people who study together, who plan together,
Mhm.
who make themselves available to organizations who do mobilizing. They don't
Mm,
necessarily mobilize, they make themselves available to organizations that do mobilizing, um, and are part of like the strategic planning for those or for that
mm,
or orgs. No, historically it's been like for a specific organization, but we were also thinking like this is a new time. So yes.
I appreciate both of you for even engaging in that question. Like, to be super clear, I didn't raise the question to be contentious. It actually just really struck me. And I think cadre, obviously it means like a cadre is a group of people that are specially trained, you know. And so it makes perfect sense. All of the points make sense, and it makes sense why the use of the word would emerge at this time. Again, I think what I was actually thinking about and even asking the question was, if for those of you that are familiar with Deepa Iyer, right? And if you aren't familiar, it's Iyer, Deepa Iyer, from Building Movement. She talks about the social justice ecosystem, and part of what she uplifts is this idea that there are actually lots and lots of different interdependent roles in the social justice ecosystem, and that movements actually need in order to succeed, in order to be victorious, and in order to thrive, right? And that in order to move toward the horizon of equity, liberation, justice, solidarity, that we need all of the things, right? We think of organizing and social justice work as, primarily the work of disruption, right? Which is absolutely part of the work. But Deepa Iyer kind of offers us to think about and consider that, we need both disruptors, caregivers, builders, visionaries, experimenters, weavers, storytellers, right? And also healers and guides and experimenters and frontline responders, right? So we know that when we're doing, Cherizar is talking about spiritual direct action. When we talk about direct action, people often organize frontline responders to do first aid on the front lines of protests, right? But what does it look like if we start to think about healers as sort of the frontline responders or first responders, who are activated continuously in formations like the ones that Sherazar talked about, right? That are where the labor doesn't rest solely on the shoulders of one person in one organization, but rather like on a collective,
mhm.
um, and integrate that into the fabric of our work. So I just wanted to bring that into saying that, while we started the conversation kind of introducing folks across a range of perspectives to the idea that healers are actually part of organizing to begin with, that there's much more evolved thinking even that says that there are so many different roles that you need in order to organize effectively. And healers are an essential part of that. I want to bring, before we close, actually, we have one last question from the viewers. And if there are other viewers who would like to bring questions to the panelists, please do so now. But we have a question in the chat, which is it our responsibility or duty to heal white oppressor counterparts? So Cherizar, you dug into this question a little bit, and I thought in a very thoughtful and generative way, and that you said, we all have ancestors and we all have ancestral practices. And so, part of working in multiracial organizing spaces is everyone, including white folks, digging back into their histories and traditions to pull from those things to heal themselves. So I want to just remind us that we were there, and I wonder if other folks have other reflections in response to this question.
I actually don't use the term healer to describe myself. I think others have used that term healer to describe me, and that always feels beautiful because I think I see the intention in that identification of me as such, but I don't think it's my responsibility to heal anyone. And I think Cherizar said something earlier that was sort of like pointing you back to yourself. I do think that that is the greatest gift, is to support people in understanding that they have the tools, or that they can have the tools that they need in order to return to themselves and to sort of go on that journey, and that we can support along the way in different ways depending on which modality you are a practitioner in. So I don't think that. I think sometimes people think that that is my responsibility, but I'm always happy to clarify with love and care. But I don't see it in my practice. I don't see this as my responsibility. And instead, I think I can illuminate some possibilities for the person who is seeking healing for themselves.
I appreciate that. And I think, just to bring it into the conversation, is that also there are widely divergent views about what a healer even is, right? So there's also a question around like shared language here.
Yeah, I think that when we first had the conversation, Madi, that was something that we discussed, because I think that the ways in which we use language and the ways that we use words, there's an assumption, right, that everybody is kind of thinking about it and feeling about it in the same way. And I said to you, I don't consider myself a healer. Like, that's not necessarily a title that I hold, right? I think of myself more as a facilitator, right? And it goes back to, what the sisters were talking about, just pointing back to self. Like, I love that, right? Pointing people back to themselves with the understanding that, that there may be some facilitation and support and guidance and, help that folks need in sort of unearthing that, all of what they hold within themselves, right? And so that for me is the role of a facilitator. And I think it is worthy of a conversation to really deconstruct some of the language that we use, right? And to begin kind of just really talking about those definitions that are so widely, the definitions of those kinds of titles and roles and identities that that we're discussing. I mean, we're discussing this whole, that's the discussion point in this talk, right? Healing justice. And so what does that mean? Right? What does that mean? What does it mean to be a healer? Right? So yeah, language. Language. Mm-hmm.
I wanna just uplift and censor, just because we haven't named her. We haven't named them. Is the Cara Page is sort of the person responsible for introducing or reintroducing and even popularizing to some degree this term healing justice. So this is sort of like the maybe the term of this moment, or it's the iteration of all that we've discussed. As I said, and I think Shane very beautifully articulated for us, like for a lot of us, this is ancestral work. This is like our collective wisdom, right? And so yeah, every generation and every in every iteration of this work, there's going to be different and new terminology. But ultimately, I think like this idea of the return to self, but the return to self as a unit. I'm always really interested in movements around like the role of the individual as a unit of social change, right? And this idea of like modeling the world that we want to live in, and modeling the ways that we want to be in the world together. Um, but also like what that means. Like you, Gloria, talked about healing and doing your personal work as a contribution to movement on some level, but also the fact that if we don't do our individual work, we also bring in, and a couple of you talked about toxicity or other things, behaviors that are actually risks and threats to healthy movements. So I just want to, as we close out, I want to kind of bring us back right into that circle of thought, and just offer each of you the opportunity, if you're to leave our viewers with like a final thought, a parting thought, an offering of any kind, what would you like people to take away from this discussion today, or what maybe even are some new questions that have emerged in listening to one another that you want to offer to the viewers for reflection?
I can start by saying infrastructure and the way that I automatically think about that is something very firm. I don't know. I mean, like that sounds like skeletal bones, and something perhaps that is unshakable. Um, but I'm thinking about that in a different way today, and sort of understanding that nothing is forever. I think we know that that's a universal truth. Nothing is forever, and that we build the things that we need in the moments that we need them, and those things are different as time goes on, and that we should, I would like to take that understanding with me as I move forward, so that I don't overcommit to something that feels so hardened that it cannot change when the world changes. And so I think I'm really committed to exploring how ever-changing infrastructure, something that sounds so solid, can and needs to be, in order for us to have and build what we need at the time that we build it. So I'm leaving with that sort of question to sit on for myself from everything that you all shared. So thank you.
I love this idea, Suhaly, of not overcommitting, right? Remain flexible. I love that. I'm taking that with me. Other folks?
So I think that for me, so much was, I mean, I've been, jotting down on my little pad here all of the gems that came from, this conversation. And so, I mean, there's like pages of this that I have. But I think that, what keeps coming to me is that, we talk about our own healing, and 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 I think that what I'd like us to really consider, and I know that we've been talking this through here as well, is that we are the communities by which we are serving, right? And so our healing is community healing. Our self-care is community care. But I really believe in my heart of hearts that the healing work that we do is justice work, right? And so how we navigate those tensions that we've been talking about, I think is worthy for more reflection and contemplation and conversation. And that, this that there is no either, it's not an either or, it's not a binary, it is an integrative part of who we are, in the capacities um, that we that we carry. And so I really like this idea of, um, giving that more consideration and more thought, and also, you know, I'm just like so bolded over by the terminology of like spiritual direct action. Like, what does that really, really look like in practice, right? I mean, I know that many of us really, do that work, but in a way that is formalized. Like, what does that really look like? And so I would love to be able to, continue the dialogue around that, and perhaps explore that more as a collective.
Thank you. Cherizar, since you are the one invoking the future of spiritual direct action, I'm going to invite you.
I'm excited for that. Y'all have my email address. Hit me up. I do want to be in conversation. Folks around this. I have some ideas. I know y'all do too. Things I want to leave folks with. Mentor somebody. Find someone, and make it a co-mentor relationship, especially if you're working with young people. We need young people. Like all the time, I'm like, wow, all this tech stuff that's coming out. I just turned 40, and I'm like, a piece of tech, but they keep me up on things, right? So they can teach me the new things, I teach them the old things, and we work well together. Please don't feel like you don't have anything to teach. You do, and someone is looking for you. So mentor somebody for sure. Check your capacity. I wrote that down. Check your capacity, then check your capacity again, and then check it again, and like every week, because I think a lot of the harm that we do in our organizations and to ourselves is from that overpromising bit, right? That overextending bit, right? And just having a huge desire, and everything feels urgent, and wanting to like do, but not actually checking in and seeing what are we capable of actually pulling off. And I think that once people get into right alignment with their actual capacity, it just moves everything out. We're not making plans for 40 people to show up and only 3 people show up to actually execute the plan. So definitely always checking your capacity. And I'm leaving with this question of, what can we use instead of kind? What is the new language we can tap into? Oh, seriously, I'm like, what is the new language we can tap into? Because this feels like a new thing, even if it's based on, its foundation is some historical formation. So yeah.
Thank you so much. And Shane, I'll leave you with the last word.
Oh, wow. Thank you for this honor. Thank you, everyone, for being here today, too. I will say that it's hard to heal ourselves if we don't feel safe. And that feeling of safety is what helps facilitate healing. So I would encourage us to look at some transformative justice principles that not only address the interpersonal harm that happens between ourselves and within ourselves, but also address systems of power. And I find that our relationship to land is an indicator for how harm, violence, trauma shows up in our lives. And so I actually find a lot of wisdom from reflecting on this book right here, Borderlands La Frontera by Gloria. And I'd like to close this out with reading a passage from the book on page 102. And it goes to say that the work of the anesthesia consciousness is to break down the subject-object duality that keeps her a prisoner, and to show up in the flesh and through the images in her work how duality is transcended. The answer to the problem between the white race and the colored, between males and females, lies in healing the split that originates in the very foundation of our lives, our culture, our languages, our thoughts. Massive uprooting of dualistic thinking in individual and collective consciousness is the beginning of a long struggle, but one that could, in our best hopes, bring us to the end of rape, violence, and war. So what I pull out of that message is to develop a sense of curiosity and don't push down when those feelings of discomfort come up. Stay in that space, stay curious, and find out where those feelings of grief, where those feelings of conflict are coming from. And oftentimes we can trace those moments of conflict within ourselves and between ourselves back to our relationship to our ancestral lands. Thank you so much for this space.
Thank you so much. That was a beautiful way to end. Thank you, Gloria, Suhaly, Cherizar, Shane. Thank you to our digital producer, Mikey Cordero from Defend PR. And thank you all for being with us this evening for the very first live virtual event of the Gathering Strength Initiative of the Action Lab. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Are we staying on?